Whenever I'm retouching my images, I always try to use a non-destructive workflow. So for example, if I wish to brighten the background in this particular image of the welder, I could use the curves or the exposure or the levels commands from the adjustment panel. And this would then give me an adjustment layer sitting above my image, which is a non-destructive and very flexible way of altering the appearance of my photograph. If I then save my image with the adjustment layers intact, it is then of course infinitely re-editable. I can come back to it in a month, a year's time, and change those settings that I've applied to the image. Now that's fine, but let's suppose I wish to actually apply a shadow highlight adjustment layer. Well, even a cursory glance at the adjustment layer panel will denote that there is no shadow highlight adjustment layer, which is unfortunate, but it's still there is still a quick workaround so that we can apply this in a non-destructive manner, so that we're not actually altering any of the pixel data. The first thing to do is to come down to the actual layer itself, and I'm going to duplicate this layer quite simply by right-clicking or command-clicking on a Mac and just clicking on the duplicate layer. Now, I'm going to change, for the purpose of brevity, I'm going to call this shadow, so we know it's the shadow highlight that we're going to be applying, and click OK. You'll notice now that I have a duplicated layer sitting above my background layer, and it's been named shadow. Now what I need to do is convert this layer into a smart object. Now, more on smart objects in another movie, but for the moment just be aware that it is the best way of working in a non-destructive manner when working with shadow highlights. So again, if I right-click or command-click on a Mac, and oops, this is one thing you can do, I need to make sure I'm not actually clicking on the thumbnail itself, but right-click on the blue area of the layer. You'll notice now that I have the ability to convert this layer to a smart object, which I'll do. Having done so, if I look at the actual layer thumbnail, you can see a little icon sitting in the bottom right-hand corner that denotes that this is indeed a smart object, and a little message will come up telling me the same if I hover over that little icon. Okay, now the next course of action is to come up to the standard image adjustments shadow highlight, and in fact you'll notice that this is the only adjustment that is available to me in this particular smart object state. So if I click on that, it now brings up my shadow highlight dialog box, which always opens at the 50% default. This is Photoshop's way of showing you what the shadow highlight box can do effectively, or the shadow highlight filter can do. Rarely am I going to use it at 50%. If I lower the slider, then I'll just drag this down to around about 30%, 28 to 30%, so that effectively I'm opening the shadows up by 30%. Now that looks pretty good, but I do wish to just darken around the welder's face here and the area of the weld, so I'm going to bring the highlight slider up to approximately 10 to 15%, really whatever works, whatever looks good. Now, having done that and click OK to apply that modification, if I come back down to my shadow layer, you'll note that below the shadow layer I can now see my smart filters. So my shadow highlight adjustment has been applied as a smart filter. I have an eye icon so I can switch on or off the visibility of that filter. I have a thumbnail, so that if I wish to, I could actually mask the filter so that it doesn't apply in all areas of the image. So for example, if I decide that I don't wish to have the effect around the edges of my frame, my welding table, I'll just click on the Smart Filter thumbnail here so that I do select that mask. And with a soft black paintbrush, so I'll select my brush or press the B key to select my paintbrush, and I'll just make sure that my color picker is displaying my default colors of black for my foreground color, white for my background color. If that is not the case, I can always press the D key to go back to my default colors. Now with my soft black paintbrush selected, I can paint away around the edges of the welding table frame so that I'm just getting rid of that effect where I don't want it, and indeed I might even do that just on the welding table itself, just darken that area. Back to the pre-shadow highlight state effectively. If I then come back over to my layer panel and I look down at my Smart Filter thumbnail, just below that, if I click on the shadow highlight dialog there, it brings up the dialog box again so that I can change my settings. Now you can imagine if I've saved this file as a PSD or as a TIFF file with the layers intact, I've got infinite control over this. I can come back to this time and again and change this effect. If, however, I'd applied this directly onto the pixels on a pixel-based layer, I would have baked that effect into the pixels, and that would be a destructive way of working. I'd particularly notice if I made a lot of edits on my image and I then went to make a large enlargement. My pixels wouldn't look as clean, my image wouldn't look as clean, and I may see some posterization. So there you have it. That's my preferred method of applying shadow highlight to an image in a non-destructive workflow.